Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dan Rizza, Director of the program on Sea Level Rise at Climate Central. For those of you who are new to Climate Central, we're a non-advocacy science and news group. On our website, you can find data, graphics, sea level rise maps, and other tools to assist you in communicating about climate impacts and solutions. This briefing is being recorded, and a recording will be emailed to you after the call. Uh, During today's webinar, we will be introducing new research and resources on the risks that sea level rise driven coastal flooding poses to hazardous facilities and the neighboring communities at risk. You'll hear from Dr. Laura Cushing, an associate professor of environmental health sciences at UCLA, Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch, a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley, who will be giving an overview of the study's findings. And you will hear from Kelly Van Balen, Program Manager for our Sea Level Rise and Climate Services programs, who will demo our interactive toxic tides tools. And then we'll hear from our other panelists who are leading voices working at the intersection of climate and health. They'll talk about what these findings mean for communities and how this research can be used for storytelling and building resilience. We'll hear from Dr. Sokobi Wilson, a professor of global environmental and occupational health, and the director of the Health, Environmental, and Economic Justice Lab at the University of Maryland. And we'll hear from Dr. Hurricane Hal Needham, director of extreme weather and disaster science at GeoTrek. And Maddie Luria, we'll hear from Maddie Luria, who's an independent journalist who collaborated with Climate Central on this project and has written extensively on the intersection of industry, environment, and public health. After the presentations, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Please add your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When possible, our panelists and staff may answer questions as we go. The contents of this webinar are under embargo until tomorrow, Thursday, November 20th at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. This means that we're sharing this information in advance of the official publication, but we request that it not be shared or reproduced elsewhere until then. So now we'll be hearing from the authors of the study, Dr. Cushing and Dr. Morello-Frosch, who will walk us through their findings. So over to you, Dr. Morello-Frosch.
Thanks so much. We're going to tee up the slides for you. So welcome, everyone. We're going to go over the results of our toxic tide study, showing how worsening coastal floods are disparately impacting marginalized communities that are hosting hazardous sites. So next slide, please. So a roadmap for this conversation today, Laura and I are briefly going to go over the report findings and our methods. And then Kelly's going to show you our mapping tool demo that is a result of this study. And then we're going to have a discussion and allow for audience questions. Next slide, please. And it takes a village to do a lot of work like this, both in terms of generating the science and then generating the data tools that everyone can use. So on the left is our science team from Climate Central, University of California, Berkeley, and LA. And we also benefited significantly from our community partners who helped us conceptualize the project, raise the money, and shape our analysis and interpretation of our results and the presentation of the tool that you will see in a second from Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Public Health Institute, CAUSE, We Act for Environmental Justice, PSR LA, and others. Next slide, please. So the motivation for the study is sea level rise is rising and rising quickly, often more than projected, and it's anticipated to more than double by 2050 worldwide. And in 2100, 90% of the coastal US is projected to experience twice per century elevated water levels on a daily basis. And 3 feet of sea level rise is expected if little to nothing is done to slow climate change by reducing greenhouse gases. And when facilities that use, process, or store toxic contaminants experience floods, as we've seen by extreme weather events, they can release hazardous substances into the environment in our air, our drinking water, and land. Next slide, please. And hazardous facilities, including those in low-lying coastal areas, many scientific studies show that they are disproportionately located in poor communities and communities of color. And so this motivated our desire to undertake this project to really understand the intersection of coastal flood risk, hazardous sites, and threats to environmental justice communities in order to really inform strategies to build equitable climate resilience efforts. Next slide, please. So the objectives of our study was to undertake a national assessment of sea level rise related flooding risk to hazardous sites in coastal areas across the United States. And we were going to test the hypothesis about the extent to which marginalized populations are more likely to live near at-risk sites that are at risk of surface flooding due to sea level rise. And then the third objective is in addition to publishing our results in the peer-reviewed literature, provide data and visualizations that can inform climate resilience policy and planning. Next slide, please. And so this project was a community research partnership process in which scientists and environmental justice and public health partners co-created the project objectives. And we wanted to ensure an ongoing process of iterative feedback on the analysis and the development of the data tool between the science team and our community partners, where the research team would be developing and proposing analysis data and how we were going to develop the mapping tool. And our partners were testing and discussing the output of our analysis, looking at the usability of the tool itself, and providing us with feedback. And then we would iteratively revive this. So what you will be seeing tomorrow is the culmination of that type of iterative and collaborative process between the science team and our community collaborators. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it on to Lara. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. I'll go over our methods and results from the paper. So to start the analysis, we assembled and geocoded a data set of the locations of nearly 48,000 coastal hazardous sites that emit, use, process, or store hazardous materials from the 4 databases that you see listed here. So these are things like regulated facilities, cleanup sites, refineries, petroleum ports, formerly used defense sites, etc. We classified the facilities by the types of permits that they had and their North American Industry Classification Code, and then estimated the extent of each facility using tax parcel data. The next step was to, at each site location, project future flood risk. We did this by calculating the probability each year that there will be a coastal flood high enough to inundate a site based on historical tide gauge records and future projected sea level rise. We considered 2 time horizons, 2050 and 2100, and 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios, a low emission scenario of moderate cuts to greenhouse gases, also known as RCP 4.5, and a high emission scenario in which greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow, RCP 8.5. And the final step was to identify communities at risk. So here we classified neighborhoods, which we defined on the basis of census block groups, as being at risk if they contained homes within a kilometer of a hazardous site with an elevated future flood risk. And then we compared the characteristics of those at-risk block groups to other coastal block groups that did not have at-risk hazardous sites nearby, with respect to several different indicators of social marginalization and vulnerability to flooding-related impacts that were constructed from the data sets you see listed here. And what we found was that under a scenario of continued high greenhouse gas emissions, we estimated 3,788 sites would be at risk of future flooding in 2050. And by the end of the century, that number would go up to 5,500 sites, including roughly a fifth of coastal sewage treatment plants, refineries, and formerly used defense sites, almost a third of coastal fossil fuel and nuclear power plants, and 40% of fossil fuel ports and terminals. The majority of these sites are located in 7 states, Florida, New Jersey, California, Louisiana, and Texas being the 5 that have the most. In the near term, sorry, what was I trying to say here? Oh, okay. Yes, so what I meant to say was that by the end of the century, we could avoid some of this flooding if we were to stabilize and then reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we estimated that we could avoid roughly 300 less sites would be at risk if we were to aggressively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. On average, looking at block groups that were near at-risk sites, we saw that they had higher proportions of eligible voters who did not vote, so a lower level of civic engagement on average, and higher percentages of households living in poverty, renters, people of color, linguistically isolated households, households without a vehicle, headed by a single parent, and individuals over the age of 65. So that's shown here in the middle column, the values in orange, the average percentages of these populations in at-risk block groups are higher than the averages in the left column, which are the neighborhoods without at-risk sites nearby. We saw similar patterns when we looked at this question using what are called multivariable regression models. That allows us to control for population density and county to account for regional differences in populations across the country. So for example, communities designated as disadvantaged using the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CGIST, which is a national screening tool combining environmental and socioeconomic indicators to identify disadvantaged communities nationwide. When we look at those communities, they had 50% higher likelihood of an at-risk site being located within 1 kilometer. For every standard deviation unit increase in the proportion of renters in a coastal neighborhood, the likelihood of an at-risk site nearby went up 41%. So in conclusion, we found that 5,500 hazardous sites are threatened by excess flooding, a 1 in a 100-year flood event by the end of the century due to sea level rise. The majority of these sites will be at risk earlier, so by 2050. And 7 states account for nearly 80% of the projected at-risk facilities. And those states are listed here. Number 2, sea level rise related flooding of hazardous sites is more likely to impact marginalized populations. This could change if we were to undertake flood risk mitigation or as a result of shifting demographics resulting from, for example, climate-related migration or things like gentrification. There are some uncertainties in the analysis that may have led us to under or overestimate the number of at-risk sites. So we didn't include all types of hazardous facilities, and we focused solely on overland flooding. So we did not account for groundwater upwelling or the increasing frequency intensity of coastal storms in our projections. Both of those factors may have led us to underestimate the number of sites at risk. On the other hand, the bathtub model that we relied upon can overestimate exposure in the most extreme storm events in some locations, which may have led us to overestimate the number of at-risk sites. And ultimately, future local site-specific work would be needed to fully characterize the threats posed by sea level rise at individual locations. So I'll stop there and pass it back to Dan. The results of this analysis will be coming out tomorrow in the journal Nature Communications.
Thanks so much, Dr. Morella-Frosch and Dr. Cushing, for walking us through those important findings. Now we'll hear from my colleague, Kelly Van Balen, who will demonstrate how you can access localized data and graphics incorporating these findings using the interactive toxic tides maps. So over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Dan. Let me just share my screen. All right, so as Rachel mentioned, or Laura mentioned, tomorrow we'll be releasing 2 interactive maps to help you dig into the detailed data that the study offers. This first map here is our toxic tides facilities map. And the first thing you'll want to do when you get to this map is search for the location that you're interested in. You can do that by using the drop down on the left side of the screen to select your state of interest, and using the search bar in the top right to search for a specific location. Our maps are built on Google Maps interface, so any location you can search for in Google, you can search for in our maps. So in this case, I'm selecting California and searching for the city of Oakland. That'll bring you to a more zoomed in view like this. And here you can see the map a little bit better. You can see that each neighborhood here is color coded from yellow to red to purple by the percentage of people there who are living below twice the federal poverty line. And the hazardous facilities are represented by these dots and shapes that are in blue to white. That color coding represents the level of flood risk to each state. More blue equals more risk. Oops. You can hover over any of the facilities to get more details about it, including its name, what type of facility it is, and a link to the data source, and how many floods it is expected to experience in the selected year. So in this case, we're looking at the San Antonio Creek wet weather facility in the East Bay Municipal Utility District, which is a sewage treatment plant expected to flood 12 or more times a year by 2100. So by default, the map shows all hazardous facility types, but you can use this filter in the bottom left to select which facility types you want to show. If you just want to see cleanup sites, or you just want to see industrial facilities or power plants, this will let you do that. You can also adjust the year, choosing between 2100 and 2050 using the toggle in the left side panel. And well, by default, you can see all the facilities that have at least a 1% annual chance of flooding in the selected year. You can also adjust the threshold so you can only see facilities that are expected to flood once or more a year, or even more often than that. Finally, you can go to the Change Other Settings menu by clicking this button here in the left side panel, which opens this toolbox, which will allow you to adjust the pollution scenario and see how things could change if we limit our heat trapping pollution, as well as adjust the social vulnerability metric that's shown on the base map. So for example, here I've switched from having it show the percentage of folks living in poverty to the percentage of people who rent. Once you've selected all of your preferred settings, you can do a lot to share this map. You can click this embed button in the top right corner, which will open up a menu. You can mess around with the settings a little bit and copy a code that will allow you to embed this in your own website or newsletter or whatever. You can also click the share button to share it directly via email or on Facebook or Twitter. Or the download button will allow you to get both a high resolution map image of exactly what you're looking at, or the CSV data behind the map that includes facility level data. If you have questions about the methodology behind the map, you can click the Details and Limitations button, which will pop open this menu here, which includes definitions, data sources, more information about the methodology. Of course, you can always reach out to us with questions as well. And in addition to this map, we've created a second map that aggregates the data by county and state. You can switch maps by clicking the Choose Map button and selecting the Toxic Tides Regions map. That'll bring you to a map that looks like this, where each county with at-risk facilities is color-coded by the number of hazardous facilities within it. Similarly to the other map, you can hover over a county to get the exact number of facilities at risk. And finally, I just want to point out that all of our maps are available in Spanish, which can be accessed by clicking the Espanol button in the bottom right of the screen. So we'll be sharing links to these maps in a follow-up email tomorrow. And I know this was a bit of a crash course on how to use them. So if you have questions on how to use the maps or you want a demo for your organization, feel free to reach out to me and I will be happy to help. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Kelly. Next up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Sokobi Wilson. And I wanted to mention again that these materials are under embargo until tomorrow, Thursday, November 20th at 5 a.m. Eastern. So we request that you don't share anything from this webinar until then. So Dr. Wilson, thanks for joining us. I wanted to ask you, what kinds of short and long-term health effects can result from exposure to floodwaters contaminated by industrial or sewage releases?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Great presentation, and really excited to be here. If you think about floodwaters and people are trying to escape through a toxic soup, if you're living near floodwaters where it's sewage treatment plants, or you think about North Carolina with industrial hog farms, for example, look at Hurricane Floyd, 1989 is one example. You'd be exposed to microbial agents, and so there could be issues with dysentery, GI illness if you're exposed to bacteria like E. coli. For those more industrial-related facilities, so you're thinking about the petrochemical operations, the Houston Ship Channel, the country's largest petrochemical corridor, Cancer Alley, refineries across the country from Newark to Richmond, et cetera. You're exposed to chemicals including heavy metals, petroleum products, hydrocarbons, also pHs. So there could be issues around rashes, burning eyes, nose, and throat. Think about dermal exposure, rashes, also inhalation, ingestion-related exposures and impacts. So chemical exposures, headaches, fatigues, fever, short-term exposure, and then for folks who are vulnerable, maybe have an underlying health condition, those health conditions could be exacerbated during those flood events. So people may have asthma and cardiopulmonary conditions, right? But then long-term, contribute to reproductive effects, of course, contribute to cancer, can damage different organs like kidney and liver. So you can have both short-term effects to chemical and microbial contaminants in the floodwaters, and also long-term effects to those chemical and microbial contaminants in flow. And let me not forget mold, of course. So to those who going back after the event, could be exposed to mold that could also have respiratory effects and other adverse health effects.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. That underscores why these findings are so important. I also wanted to ask you, you've written about natural, technological, or NATEC disasters. Could you explain what a NATEC disaster is and how climate, the built environment, and socioeconomic factors can compound risks like those described in this research?
Yeah, definitely. So, NATEC disaster is a natural technological disaster. So, it's a technological event that occurs due to a natural disaster. So, for example, you have a hurricane that comes through an area, and you may have a facility that gets flooded. Look at the Hurricane Harvey, which dumped 31 trillion was it gallons of rain in Houston, and what happened at the Valero facility. Right. If you think about again going back to Hurricane Floyd, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Florence too, North Carolina, the industrial hog farms, right? You can have those hog farms can get flooded out, so the lagoons can breach, right, and then contaminated. The flood waters can get to people's wells or into people's homes. They can be exposed to biological contaminants. Or you look at Hurricane Sandy and what happened after Hurricane Sandy with the waterfront facilities, those industrial facilities that flooded New Jersey and the flood water. So basically, you can have again a natural event that leads to a spill, a leak, an explosion at a facility. And so for those based on this research, we see that you have underlying vulnerabilities that drive risk. So many folks, and for Cancer Alley, again, to parts of California and other in the 7 states that were mentioned, think about those communities that are overburdened by those industrial hazards are those sewage treatment plants or the agricultural hazards like CAFOs. And so you have compounding vulnerability when it comes to their socioeconomic status, in some cases, the role of racism and leading to that disproportionate burden. And also, you have a hazard vulnerability, plus you have the geographic vulnerability based on proximity to the hazard, and also whether in the floodplain or in an area that tends to flood a lot. So, compounding vulnerabilities, in addition to those populations, may have compounding susceptibilities, right? Again, biological factors, age, children, elderly more at risk during these flood events. Also, they may have an underlying health issue, or they may have a family history, which makes them more at risk when you have these flood events. And so, NatTech disasters are something we have to really think about when we're talking about climate change. And so, as we do this work and use that great map, I love the map, y'all. How do we really, I like to say, identify, prioritize, and micro target areas that may be more at risk from non-tech disasters and understand the role of climate change? So, baking this type of mapping tool into a climate action plan, it will be really important for communities that have environmental justice issues and have a history of non-tech disasters.
Thanks, Dr. Wilson. Yes, we see community leaders across the country using our maps and local government officials and many more. You've worked in partnership with community-based organizations and community leaders to do participatory research.
Yep.
What's the benefit of conducting research in this way, and what insights has it produced that might have been missed by more traditional research methods?
Oh yeah, great question. I don't want to be too long-winded because I think I've been already long-winded in responses. I'll try to be a little more succinct. But no, it's really
Yeah,
what's
take your
really
time.
powerful about. Oh, go ahead, go ahead. You're fine. Go ahead, Dan.
Take your time. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool. So thank you. So I'll slow down a little bit. I mean, I it's really powerful when you have community members helping to develop the questions in the study design. And that's the power of participatory research, or you call it citizen science, community science. And for me, you want to uplift those community cultural knowledge systems. The folks who live in these communities who are experiencing environmental injustices, who are experiencing climate injustices, who are experiencing the flood events, who are experiencing natural disasters, they are the contextual experts. So when you're developing a study to understand the issue and coming up with a mitigation strategy, their expertise has to be prioritized because it helps to inform and make sure we have the best research to get to the best solutions. So I say bad data in, bad policy out, right? But if you're working with communities, it's good data in and good policy out. So we've been doing work, with communities across the country on environmental justice and climate justice issues. We worked with colleagues at Duke University to do a project on natural disasters in the Carolinas, looking at folks who were impacted by disasters in hog farm country in eastern North Carolina, and also working with folks in North Charleston, looking at natural disasters in North Charleston, South Carolina. So I think that's the value of working with communities. They're experiencing these issues all the time. So you can make sure that you're getting the best, again, study design, the best data out, getting the best policy in the context of what the team just showed. You're really going to need to work with communities to make sure that we have really localized, hyper localized climate action plans, and taking into account the hazard profiles, taking into account the climate scenarios, taking into account past flooding history, taking into account the public health, current public health conditions, right? So I think by doing that, we can make this more equitable, and it's more democratic when you're engaging those frontline, fence line communities who've been experiencing these climate issues and who've experienced the flooding events and who've been experiencing, these non-tech disasters we just talked about.
Thanks, Dr. Wilson. And related to that, the Health, Environmental, and Economic Justice Lab that you direct provides technical assistance to communities dealing with risk like those described in this research. How can tools like the Toxicotide map support vulnerable communities? I mean, you've already gone into this in your previous answer, but are there other ways you can think of while we have you here?
Well, I'm a map geek. I love maps. I would say that this tool, in relation to some other great tools out there, I think it'd be a combo. So teaming up with the EDF has their climate vulnerability index map, right? So there's opportunities to see integrating or having a platform where this tool plus CVI and other tools, CGIS of course is offline, but we do have CDC has their EJ index. And then we have many of the states from California to Minnesota to Oregon, I think, to Washington State, Michigan, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, I'm trying to name all the states that have state level EJ tools. So you can update those tools and have either a module, a toxic tods module in those tools. But the idea is how we can integrate this national tool and connect to those state level tools to, again, help identify, prioritize, and monitor target areas of most need. So I think that's the value of maps and these type of screening tools. And also I think there's power. I think you give more power to the people when you bring these type of tools. So I like to call it empowerment science. So I think this type of tool would really help with the empowerment science work that we're doing in the Mid Atlantic. A lot of work we're doing around climate change and climate justice. So just a quick example, but I really like the idea of integrating these tools together and making sure we bring the best tools to the people so we can get the best mitigation strategies out.
Thanks for that, Dr. Wilson. We're always inspired by how we're hearing communities are using our maps, often for reasons we hadn't thought of before, but gives us ideas of how to improve them in the future. But it's so
Yes, sir.
important to hear how this has practical implications for community-based organizations. So now let's go to Hurricane Hal. Thanks, Dr. Wilson. So Dr. Needham, you've spent years on the ground studying weather and climate disasters and their impacts on communities. What patterns do you see in how floods and storms are reshaping life along the coast, particularly for vulnerable neighborhoods?
Yeah, Dan, we're seeing two things really. We're seeing more frequent flooding. So, with subsidence or sinking of the coastline in conjunction with sea level rise, we're seeing a lot of flooding even on sunny days. Without a drop of rain, you can see flooding in the streets along the upper Texas coast. And we also really see it when we have a coastal storm. When we have a coastal storm, we typically get strong onshore winds that's pushing salt water in. Then, even if it only rains maybe 2 or 3 inches, the rain cannot drain because the tides are up. And so we call that compound flooding. We're seeing a lot more frequent coastal flooding. And also we're seeing a lot of rapid intensification of hurricanes. 7 times over the past 9 hurricane seasons, we've seen hurricanes rapidly intensify, meaning that maximum sustained winds increased by at least 40 miles an hour in the last 24 hours before landfall. It's happened 7 times over the past 9 seasons, but only 12 times since 1950. So that warm Gulf water is really helping these storms rapidly intensify before hitting the land.
Thanks. I also wanted to ask you, from your podcast to your hurricane tours, you spent a lot of your career translating science into stories. So, what have you learned about the most effective ways to communicate flood and storm risk?
Dan, really two things. Number one, I try to focus on the storm impacts. And number two, I try to keep the message very simple. So, I do a lot of work broadcasting in August and September during the heart of hurricane season. A couple of years ago, I was on the beach doing a live broadcast, and a woman came up to me and gave me a hug, and she said, "Thank you so much for not talking about millibars." What
Hmm.
she meant is millibars are a measure of air pressure, and a lot of times we'll hear forecasters talk about the air pressure, the wind shear, the different models. I've learned at the end of the day, most people have two concerns. How likely is my house going to flood? And how likely are winds going to damage my home? And so I try to really focus on those impacts and just keep the message very simple.
That makes a lot of sense. So what does resilience look like in a place like Galveston, where rising seas, subsidence, and industrial development collide?
Well,
What have
Dan,
you seen that gives you hope, and what do you see where there are gaps?
yeah, we have a long history of storms and different disaster impacts here. The deadliest disaster in U.S. history happened right here in my neighborhood during the 1900 storm on September 8th, 1900. Galveston really, in a way, embraces that history. If you spent time in the city, we have high water marks everywhere from all of our storms. You can find them scattered throughout the island and especially downtown. So there is definitely an awareness of our past flood history. People really are taking that awareness to, I would say, give themselves a buffer to get out ahead of this. I see a lot of the new construction seems to be built a lot higher on pilings and really elevated above the ground. So I think people are trying to elevate and trying to get up above the floodwater, which is really good news. And people take storms seriously here. I think a few of the gaps that we're seeing, I really feel like people don't understand the risk here of these rapidly intensifying hurricanes. I'm always concerned about South Florida, Metro New Orleans, and the upper Texas coast. I do know this last year, the local government increase the evacuation guidance from 48 hours to 72 hours. And as we're talking about, if a massive hurricane were to hit here, like on 4th of July weekend or Labor Day weekend, mathematically, it would be very hard to get everyone off the island. Conversations about shelter in place, vertical evacuations, or even embracing creative strategies like floating houses or different innovations that help block floodwaters. I wish that they were taken more seriously, or people were embracing these creative solutions more. And then the last thing I'll mention, I'm really concerned in a lot of coastal communities when they have policies that block reentry of citizens who evacuate for a storm. I understand security is a big concern, but that said, I talk to a lot of local residents who say, I'm not going to evacuate because they're not going to let me back in to treat mold and things like that if my house floods. And I'm concerned that, people will not get themselves out of harm's way because the policy does not allow them back in after a storm. Things like that I'd like to see adjusted in the future.
Thanks so much, Dr. Needham, and we're getting some great insights from you and Dr. Wilson. And it's good to hear how you're translating science into stories. So we'll circle back with you during the Q&A session. But finally, let's go to Maddie Loria. Um, Maddie, you've covered the impacts of climate change and industry on the environment and public health in places across the U.S. Where do you typically get started when you're reporting?
Well, locally, I always like to start with the communities. Like Dr. Wilson said, the people who live in these places are usually the experts, right? So you want to take that hyper local approach and honestly just start driving around, right? You look at these reports, you can look at the tool, but then actually go to the community, drive around, especially if you can, like after a storm, and see like where are the floodwaters remaining, knock on doors, go to businesses, like talk to everyday people. And I think that's where you're going to find, the challenges that they're dealing with either on a regular basis or historically. I know Dr. Needham and I had some conversations about how sometimes, like for example, FEMA flood maps like don't line up with reality. And so you just really need to go to these places and talk to the people that are experiencing them, and then rely on experts like Dr. Wilson and you guys at Climate Central to help guide the science to tell the stories there too.
Thanks, Maddie. I know you've used the new toxic tides data to write about the impacts of coastal flooding on fossil fuel infrastructure. So what guidance can you offer about using the data and maps for similar reporting?
Yeah, sure. So there's so many sites that are targeted in this study and this report. So it can feel like a heavy lift, but having the mapping tool is going to be really helpful for you to kind of focus on a specific area, or like I did with the fossil fuel sites, kind of like a specific industry. And then once you look at it, you'll start to see some themes. So, I wish that I had the next 5 years to just break out different stories from this report. But again, like you said, I focused on the fossil fuel kind of focused sites. And one thing I saw was bad actors, right? Like there was at least one company that had multiple sites that were prone to risks and that would potentially impact people who maybe couldn't evacuate or deal with cleanup, or who would be put in harm's way, who also have a history of violating environmental laws, right? And having just problems regardless of, accidents, or, as one expert said, companies often like to call this an act of God, but really it's a failure to prepare. So I'm really curious, like how much companies look at this issue as part of doing business too, right? Because they don't want to mess with their bottom line. But I don't know that we're seeing enough preparation in that sense of things. So looking at particular companies would be great. But then also the different types of facilities that are highlighted in this report. Obviously refineries and ports are going to be located near waterways. They need that for commerce. But sewage plants and CAFOs could have really long-lasting environmental and health impacts if they're hit by major storms or flood events. And those can linger for a long time and maybe don't get as reported or don't have the same kind of releases that they have to report to the EPA or things like that. And again, I wonder, like, how prepared are these places to weather an emergency? And I think the answer we might find with a lot of them would be that they're not really, right? Um, so yeah, so it's really easy to get pulled into that doom and gloom, but Dr. Needham was saying, there are solution stories in this too. So like, what are communities doing to make themselves more resilient, right? Like I did some reporting in the city of Wilmington here in Delaware, looking at kind of nature-based solutions for flooding issues that would also end up releasing sewage into people's homes or the communities, and that seems to be working decently well. We'll see into the future. But Dr. Cushing also noted in her presentation that if emissions can be curbed, there are about 300 sites that wouldn't face the same level of risk, right? If we keep just putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as planned. So I think looking into those facilities and how we could get there, right, would also be a really good opportunity for reporting.
Thanks, Maddie. I think you've already answered this question, but what stories do you think are still untold? Do you have any other ideas, that approaches or angles that you wanted to add here before we go to the Q&A session?
Yeah, I think I kind of jumped right into that with
Yeah,
that one
that's
because it
great.
was top
I
of mind
think,
when I was
yeah, I think
preparing for
that's,
this and
yeah,
remembering all the things that I wish we had the time to work on. So,
yeah, that sounds good. So I think, what we could do now is you could be part of the Q&A session. And thanks so much for speaking here. And we've really enjoyed reading everything you've already written about toxic tides data.
of course, great
Um,
working with you on this.
So we have a fair amount of time for Q&A now, so please add your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I wanted to ask Dr. Cushing and Dr. Morella-Frosch first, how do you hope this research is used or built upon? What do you think would ideally come next in your mind? Um,
Um, well, two things. I think tools like this, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, can complement other existing tools that can help diverse end users, decision makers, and communities that are trying to put forth climate resilient strategies going forward. And I think our tool in particular kind of is a broad-based kind of screening approach that can show how, risks can be reduced in key areas. And as we showed, a handful of states account for 80% of the at-risk sites, which can point us into places that we really want to emphasize. For example, more robust assessment of cleanup sites in order to, inform activities and also make decisions about suitable reuse of cleanup sites in the future, given the realities of sea level rise and future flooding threats. And more support for action-oriented partnerships where, there's, for example, in California, our initial work there really catalyzed interest by decision makers to provide resources for communities that were shown to be at risk of sea level rise related flooding threats. And this tool on a national basis could help enable communities to access more resources to do that kind of important work.
yeah, over to you, Dr. Cushing. Thank you.
I would just add that our goal was with this analysis was try to get ahead of the problem, right? By looking far out into the future. We do have time to respond and try to mitigate the risks and also increase resilience, as Dr. Morella-Frosch was describing. So that was really there were several questions in the Q&A, why are we focusing on the worst case scenario and all the way out into the future? And one reason for that is to get ahead of the problem, right? So point out areas that need more research, need more site-specific evaluation to fully characterize the risks and try to mitigate them.
Thanks. And while I have you both here, and I see Kelly's online, we had another question come in asking if there are any plans to expand the tool to cover increasing frequency and intensity of storms. They mentioned there's an increasing concern about RIDs and record-breaking storms of increasing intensity. Any thoughts on that front you'd like to share?
We don't currently have any plans to expand the research like that. It's hard to quantify exactly how much stronger storms are going to get in the future in a kind of, yeah, in a projecting future-looking sense. Though Climate Central does have research about how hurricanes have gotten stronger, as in like having more higher wind speeds over the years. I think I can find that and share it in the chat, that tool. But we do have kind of numerical evidence of how climate change has increased the intensity of hurricanes over the years, and we expect that trend to continue.
Thanks, Kelly. Actually, while you're here, we had another question come in asking, do you have any data for non-US location sites, or do you have suggestions on how parallel data can be extrapolated for non-US contexts?
Yeah, I'll pass this back to Laura and Rachel too for more context on studying this. We don't have data on hazardous facilities at risk in other countries. Although our mapping tool, if that choose map section that I showed before, the maps can show projected sea level rise and coastal flooding around the world. So the challenge there, I think, would probably be getting good enough data on the location of the facilities that we'd be interested in. But if you're interested in looking at a specific facility, the maps can help with that. Laura and Rachel, you have anything to add on future directions?
Well, we are trying to take, as Kelly mentioned, getting data in terms of the location of similar types of hazardous facilities in other countries that may not be as data rich as we were able to access here in the US. Is challenging. So right now we're trying to look at, for example, what is the ecology of data sources, for example, along the US-Mexico border on the Mexico side, where if we could expand the analysis a bit more there. But we also need to acquire resources to take that to the next level. And we're just right now trying to assess the viability of that to expand to Mexico. So stay tuned.
Great. While you're here, we had another question. Someone said Dr. Masad Agahi at UCLA supported the United American Indian Involvement Initiative support residents during the LA floods. Have you shared this information with them? That's a question to the group. I suppose you haven't yet because it hasn't been released, but
Yeah, not. I'm at UCLA as well, but so I appreciate the suggestion to connect.
Another question came in. Under the Trump administration, the EPA has discontinued access to a number of websites that deal with environmental justice. Will this affect your tool?
That's a great question. It won't affect our analysis or our tool, but it would impede our ability to do similar work going forward. So several of the data sets that we relied upon have been taken down. Luckily, they've been archived at through other initiatives to archive that data and make it available online. But going forward, ultimately, we're seeing a real loss of data availability around a whole host of environmental topics and environmental justice topics that's going to result in communities not having access to the type of information that's really needed to make good decisions to improve climate resilience.
Thanks. Here's another question that came in. I think this would be a good one for Dr. Wilson, and then perhaps Dr. Needham and Maddie can also chime in. Terry asks, how does one not overwhelm residents how does one not overwhelm residents when the problems like these get so complex?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know in Dr. Marilla Frost's work in the Silent Spring Institute, they do a lot of great work about the ethical report back, and I was put that in like as part of the scientific communication, right? How you communicate in a way with care, in consideration of, like you said, that there are a lot of problems that folks are experiencing. And so one of the things I try to do is not be woe is me, the sky's falling, because I think at least in the climate space, we've done a great job of saying the world is going to end, and for a lot of communities that I work in who are experiencing environmental injustices, they're already dealing with that kind of toxic trauma and even the toxic reporting. So that's why it's important to have the social movement part of it, the environmentalist movement, because the movement is about people, it's about hope, it's about solidarity, right? And it's not the best answer to the question, but I think that movement building, coalition building, leveraging resources, working with anchor institutions and community is part of that resilience. And that gets back to the resilience question. Resilience is important, and social resilience is important, but I think the relationships to trust, that is key when we're thinking about the issues at hand in those communities, but also in this moment. I want to get into this moment in the country, but it's also important to be resilient, right? And not also to get into what I like to call toxic resilience. We're expecting people to bounce back each time. We have to move beyond resilience and to a certain extent to talk more about how we can help people thrive. And I do think that is, again, relationships, thinking about the vision for the future beyond just the negative impacts. But it can be tough. So I feel like I'm meandering a little bit, but these are questions that we're trying to answer all the time. Communities that I work in, when they're being used as sacrifice zones, they're being dumped on, and they have these additional threats. But I think those small wins are important. The storytelling behind those wins are important. We got to celebrate those victories, and we try to do that in our work. And one last point, I'll pass the mic. Just as an example, we just had our annual symposium. The theme of the symposium was the People's Agenda: Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. So as we are helping people through these moments and struggling through these problems, we have to focus on resilience, but also restoration. How do you restore folks? How do you keep them healthy mentally as they're going through these fights? So hopefully that was helpful. I'll pass the mic back.
Thanks, Dr. Wilson. Dr. Needham, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, we found it helpful to give people solutions or action steps they can take that are achievable and affordable. We have a community here in Galveston that may flood as many as 40 to 50 days a year with salt water. And last year we got connected with Rahel Abraham. She's an African American innovator in Houston. She actually designed a waterproof bag that'll zip around your car after Hurricane Harvey. We got some of these bags, brought them to this flood prone community. We rolled up to someone's driveway. The salt water was already in their driveway. An 82-year-old woman last year. We said, I know we sound crazy. Could we zip up your car with what we call ClimaGuard, this waterproof bag? She said, let's do it. So we zipped her car up. And during the flood, she was taking pictures every few hours. Her car would have flooded, but it stayed dry because of the ClimaGuard bag that Rahel Abraham innovated. So that concept, these bags are $400, and it can keep someone's car from flooding. Things like that are achievable, affordable, tied on to the end of your climate message. I think it gives people hope, like, okay, there's something I can do instead of just waiting like a sitting duck for me to have my house or my car flood.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Needham. Yeah. Maddie, I was going to ask you to chime in on this one, but I have another question for you from someone who sent it for you. They ask, how willing were industrial interests to talk to you or for your interviews? Did some professionals in this field, were they open to talk?
No, not so much. So again, that was kind of an area that I hoped I had more time to explore. I put a couple feelers out and nobody really wanted to. I ended up, perusing SEC filings to kind of see if there was anything in there, right? Because publicly traded companies are going to have to report risks. So that's a good place to start. They may not be really open about it, but you can start there and keep trying. I know I have a request out to the Delaware State Refinery I need to follow up on.
Thanks for that. I want to go back to this is probably for Dr. Cushing and Morella Frosch, but Ezra asks, she states, Well, Ezra states we've worked on stories together over the years on the topic focused on the Bay Area and California. So, two questions: how does this new information build on what you already published in the past? Sort of like what lessons are you learning from California and the Bay Area for the rest of the nation? And can you talk about how many sites there are in California and the Bay Area? That's a question from Ezra for Dr. Morello-Frosch and Dr. Cushing.
Go ahead, Lara, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi, Ezra. So this analysis does build on the methods we developed first in California. And we can get you the exact numbers in terms of the number of hazardous sites for California and Bay Area. They may differ slightly from what we found previously because in this analysis, we sought to apply a standardized approach to the whole country, which means we relied on slightly different data sets for some of the data inputs that are only available in California. We had to use something else that's available nationwide. So the two analyses I would consider sites flagged under either analysis, the state specific or the national, as potentially at risk. And we're happy to work with you to identify those sites exactly. Rachel, maybe you want to speak to some of the lessons learned from our California work.
I think some of the lessons learned from the California work, one was this project originated in California because of deep interest among EJ groups in different parts of the state in coastal areas having a deep interest in how to prepare communities for sea level rise, and in the Bay Area in particular. Also, how can this type of analysis inform the redevelopment of land, for example, that is previously contaminated? How does this have implications for suitable land reuse in formerly toxic sites or in industrial sites? So I think this kind of work can also inform those conversations, not just, how do you redevelop formerly used sites and toxic sites, but what's appropriate to make sure we're not sort of getting into regrettable substitutions or redevelopment strategies that really don't take into account the realities of the changing landscape due to sea level rise.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to try to squeeze two questions in here. Maybe we could start with Dr. Wilson, or chime in for these. George asks, you don't address moving hazardous facilities and communities out of harm's way. He says retreat may be the best scenario in certain instances. And Terry asks, said, wonderful suggestions regarding not re-traumatizing. He said this may be too in the weeds, but any suggestions for low-income neighborhoods with basement apartments that flood? Would anyone like to, Dr. Wilson, would you like to chime in on this one? And then others can chime in as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the basement one is tough one to deal with. I think we have to work with tenant associations on that. And when I talked about before how you can really hyper localize your climate action plan, I think that maybe is an area need, right? So tenant associations, working with property managers, working with those city officials who those housing units, right? So the Department of Housing in major cities to make sure that they're thinking about basement apartments, because what we saw with the recent hurricane that hit New Orleans, right, and then it swung through and it came to New York, and we had people who unfortunately were flooded in their basements, and they died because of the flooding in their basements. I think that's an area of need. So our larger metropolitan housing units, like in New York, for example, that's one place we could start, and maybe having a model sort of approach to engaging tenants and low income residents when it comes to basement flooding. I think that's the place to start. But I believe that's like a blind spot right now, and not enough has been done in that area.
Thanks, Dr. Wilson. I wish I could ask for, you all to chime in on this one, but we're really approaching the top of the hour, so we're gonna have to wrap this up. I really wanted to thank Thanks for your questions and your time today, and thanks for all of our speakers for sharing their insights and expertise. As a final reminder, the contents of this webinar are under embargo until tomorrow, Thursday, November 20th at 5 a.m. Eastern. After the embargo is lifted, we will be following up with a recording and links to the research and materials discussed via today by email. We'll share contact information for all the speakers today in the chat now, and our team's contact information will also be included in the follow-up email. So please reach out at any time if you have questions about the data or how to apply this to your reporting and stories. And if you haven't yet, please sign up for our email updates on Climate Central's sea level rise related work. The link will be in the chat. And so with that, we'll wrap this up. Thanks again for your time today, and take care.